Reason being, I had a previous session and one of my other colleagues needed a bit of help with regards to doing this session in the office today. So that's the reason it took a bit of time, but I'm glad that we've managed to finally get there. What we're going to do is progress on with something that we were kind of studying last week, which was the unit principles of marketing, principles and techniques. And here, what I'm going to do is obviously continue with that particular unit. And what we're going to do is obviously look at, the learning outcome 3 today, which I'm just pulling up on the screen. And this will essentially talk about, looking at what we did last time was in terms of learning outcome 2, we covered something to understand how do we do market research, why do companies look at doing market research, what kind of research they do, which is primary, secondary, and in some cases it is tertiary research. And we looked at the basic, techniques of doing different types of research. Now, what we're going to do is extrapolate and extend that into learning outcome 3 to try and understand what are the different techniques that we use, when we do market research. So in particular, what we're going to do is focus on 2 or 3 techniques, which at this level, which is at level 3, are relevant. And you should be able to, understand these techniques. So what I've done is I've put together a presentation which basically looks at some market analysis techniques, which is SWOT analysis in particular, PESTEL analysis, and to a certain extent, what we look at is competitor analysis. Now, there are lots of different models that we can use to do, comparison, comparing activities, or doing analysis of one company or one business with another organization. But as a start, most cases what we tend to do is we end up doing some sort of analysis which are primarily to understand the strengths and weaknesses, and also to understand what are the factors which kind of affect the business from outside. So we're going to be looking at these 2 in particular to begin with, which is SWOT and PESTEL. And this is what we're going to look at taking forward. So just going through a few slides today that I put together, and then towards the end, what we look at is how do we look at presentation of data when we've collected, data from using these analysis or analytical techniques. Now, apart from this, once we go look at going through some of these presentation slides, what I'm going to try and do is obviously send you a handout which will be an example of detailed PESTEL analysis and also an example of a detailed SWOT analysis that you could look at to kind of perfect what we are going through in terms of today's session. Is that okay? Now, going forward, let's look at a few definitions first. Now, what do you understand by the term analysis? Or let's put it this way, when we look at market analysis. So, what we need to be able to do is let's look at some of the definitions of these core terms first to begin with. Now, analysis as a word, primarily looks at talking about some sort of, when you look at doing some sort of a detailed explanation of a particular thing. For example, it could be a business. You're looking at detailing out maybe the activities of the business. You're looking at primarily, say, looking at, say, for example, a particular question, if you're looking at doing an assignment, and in that you have the verb which is being used called analysis. And analysis there would mean that you're looking at presenting a detailed examination of a particular topic, which is going to be addressed in the assignment. Now, when we look at expanding that to market analysis, so market analysis would mean that you're looking at doing some sort of a detailed examination of a business or a company or a particular situation within a particular sector or a specific industry. So this is a technique that we normally use when we are looking at trying to analyze or trying to understand in a bit more detail about the situation of a particular business or a company in the context of marketing. And here, in order to do that, what we tend to do is we use some very basic level of tools, to try and look at doing some analysis. And these basic tools include SWOT and PESTEL. Now, SWOT would be, as the word stands for, I think you would have come across this, quite a lot. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. And the reason why we look at these tools, say for example, SWOT and PESTEL. PESTEL is an acronym which stands for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal challenges or changes which affect a particular business. Now, these two particular tools are used under market analysis when you want to understand and also kind of segment, detail out, whatever you call it. You're looking at basically understanding in detail the situation or factors which are affecting the business. Now, we look at SWOT from a point of view of looking at micro analysis, because micro would be the fact that when we look at this kind of an analysis, the idea is you're looking at doing the analysis of a situation, or for example, looking at the situation from an internal perspective. These are factors which would affect the company or a business from an internal point of view, or from internally within the organization. And when you look at doing a PESTEL analysis, what we are looking at is we are looking at doing a macro analysis or study of the factors which are going to be affecting the business or an organization from an external point of view. So SWOT analysis is nothing but looking at it's a tool which allows you to kind of look at a business or an organization from a situational basis, and this is something which could be used to do a broad range of a broader range of study, in particular for a particular product, company, whatever it is. And that would mean that you're looking at identifying the factors which kind of affect the business internally. And here you're looking at going into understanding the strengths and the weaknesses, what are the opportunities and threat which the company can actually, or a business can actually have from a point of view of looking at, understanding the situation. So a market analysis would primarily look at, it's a technique which we normally look at in which we will undertake some sort of an investigation, study, or doing a research. And here the idea would be to try and understand that particular area, sector, operation of a business or an organization in a greater detail, which could align with the vision, the mission, the strengths and weaknesses, or the opportunities and threats of an organization. And that is where you will look at this as a particular technique that we are going to look at. When you study further, we will be adding a lot of other frameworks and models to be able to do detailed market analysis for a particular product, situation, environment, company, business. So some of the other techniques that you would have heard about would be things like a BCG matrix, which is Boston Consulting Group matrix. We also look at Ansoff matrix. We look at, for example, VRAIO, which is VRAIO. So these are VRAIO Directional Services Matrix tool. Now, these are different types of market analysis techniques that we use depending on the situation, what type of factors you're going to study or analyze, and what are the kind of factors which are going to be studied, whether it's something which is affecting the organization from internal perspective, or is it affecting the organization or business from an external perspective. So micro and macro environment. Now let's look at going into something called understanding what is SWOT. So as I've explained very briefly, SWOT basically stands for strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And here what we are looking at doing is, when you look at doing a SWOT, the idea is to look at collectively analyzing the internal and as well as external factors which may affect a particular business positively, negatively, or might not affect the business at all. So when we look at, say for example, UK undergoing Brexit, so we are talking about doing a SWOT analysis at the country level, wherein UK is leaving the European Union. And in this case, you would, if you end up using a market analysis technique like a SWOT, what you're going to be looking at doing is understanding the strengths and weaknesses of UK or Britain as an economy, and what could be the opportunities or what could be the threats that it could face when it leaves the European Union. So it is essentially a framework which allows managers, or when we look at people in general, to be able to kind of, understand what are the internal factors which affect and can boost to a certain extent company strength, and kind of deflate or minimize weaknesses by understanding those factors which affect it. And these strengths and weaknesses can be internal to the company, they can be directly managed because of the fact that these are things which can be controlled by the company itself. So for example, if you are in the manufacturing business and you say, for example, are a dairy farmer, the impact of Brexit is something which is going to be affecting all the industries. But what you could do is you could minimize your weaknesses or minimize the threats by proactively looking at putting things into place by, say, for example, hedging the variation in pound which could happen, or the exchange rate vis-a-vis euro, and you could accordingly adjust the price of your products to make sure that you are not affected by the declining pound. And in those cases, what you would do is you would adjust the price of the milk when you sell upwards, so that it does not dent the profits. Now, because you're taking this decision internally to maybe raise the prices, this is something which is internal, and that means which is something that you can decide within the company as the owner or the director. And that is why you look at doing maybe understanding SWOT as an analysis or as a tool. Now, SWOT is one of the, let's look at why do we look at SWOT. Now, SWOT, one of the clear things that we look at is this is a very widely used tool, and this is one of the most simplest form of tools that you can use to start to do some sort of analysis or understand how to break down a particular situation into what is affecting the business. Now, if we are to look at sometimes on a tangent, when I give you an example, is sometimes what tends to happen is if you've got if you've had cold and cough for a number of days, what you tend to look at is why am I the only one who's had this cold and cough in the house, or what are the things that could have enabled or what are the things which would have made me get this cold and cough. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to analyze and think about situations of why this has affected you, or where could have you caught this from as an infection. Did it happen at the workplace? Did it happen outside when you're out and about? Was it because you're not wearing warm enough clothing, or various factors? Because you're discussing them, you're looking at revisiting and kind of analyzing or looking at recollecting some of these things which are directly related to you. That is why you're able to do this analysis. And then if you think that okay, I've not been able to arrive at a conclusion, that what you do is you take some kind of a counter opinion from your family, or somebody in your family saying that why is it that I get this always, and then you look at externally asking for an opinion. So internally, because you are able to kind of put all this information together, and then at some stage you also look at some external opinions to be able to understand why this has happened. And that is why this is considered to be a very basic form of analysis or a tool that you put together, because you're looking at revisiting some of the information that you had and then putting it together into some sort of a data which allows you to come to some sort of a meaningful conclusion. Now, here the basic aim is to understand what you have and what you don't have. That is why strengths and weaknesses. And in some cases, when you look at comparing yourself with maybe the external environment or some other members of the family, you then start to look at, okay, why have I got this and not they, or something like that. Why does it affect me often as compared to others? So here you look at addressing the problem of something called threats, in terms of you start to look at whether was I not dressed, or what I was not adequately prepared in terms of wearing warm clothing and things like that. So you're still considering factors which are more or less controllable internally by yourself, and that is why this becomes the most simplest form of tool. And at some stage what you do is you decide to go and see a GP or a doctor because the condition isn't getting better, and that is where you start to look at more depending on external or professional help to be able to get kind of some sort of a solution for that problem. So similarly, companies, when they look at doing this research of why we are not doing well as compared to others or competitors, then in that case what they do is most managers would start off with the simplest of the tools to look at these study of data, collection of data, revisiting some of the information that they have, and they start to look at doing SWOT analysis. Now, what are the benefits? Now, benefits of the SWOT analysis is it is a very simple tool. It is simple enough to understand strengths, weaknesses, list it down into some sort of a, a matrix format. And it's in most cases, this is practical because you are looking at your strengths and weaknesses at that point in time. You're looking at the threats and opportunities because you're doing the analysis at any given point in time. So it is a simple tool, but yet practical. It's very easy to understand. So when you share some data with your friends and colleagues, it will be easy for them to understand. It is focused primarily on just looking at the internal factors and external factors. So you're not looking at a lot of complex data which needs to be analyzed or put together into some sort of a format for processing. And the last but not the least, this becomes, when you collect this data, this becomes the primary data for you to be able to do further studies or, look at further, detailing of if the problem persists or if there is something which is, kind of bothering you. If there's a business which is facing stiff competition, then this becomes the starting point at which you start off, and then you start to develop it into, further details to understand, okay, we've looked at identifying strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, but what are the other factors which are affecting this particular situation of the business? And then you look at, say, political factors, you look at economic factors, you look at the wider, picture. So it's not just you as a business which is affected, but then you start to look at, okay, hang on, let's try and compare ourselves with some of the others in the sector to see if there are other businesses which are also having a downturn, or if other businesses are finding it tough because of the exchange rate. So you broaden your analysis by getting into other techniques, and that is why, this is maybe a starting point. Now, some of the limitations are that, sometimes you get to see that many managers, because it's a simple tool, will not consider it, kind of a serious enough, exercise in terms of study being put together, because it only looks at you and the company or the business in question, but does not look at, in general, the larger environment in which the business operates. Now, the other thing which is very important, and it turns out to be a limitation in this case, is that you do see that there is no prioritization of factors. That means you cannot prioritize your strength first, or weakness, or opportunities, or threat, and there is no such way wherein this can be done in an orderly fashion, or you can define priority. So prioritization is an issue when we look at doing SWOT analysis, because it does not reflect a particular strength or an opportunity at any given point in time, but it talks about it in a generic fashion. And the factors tend to be quite broad. So that brings us to the next limitation. And sometimes what you do is, when you collect some data, the data or the strengths or weaknesses, you might say that the company has been going for 20 years and, we have a goodwill. Now, that is not something which is backed up by factual data. You might be going for 20 years, but only the last 2 years of the company have been profitable. Like, for example, Tesla has been going for a number of years, but the only, it has only made it's only kind of made profit once in its operation in the last so many years. So that factor could be considered a strength, that it's been going for a number of years. It made profit last year, but when we look at a larger or a macro view of looking at how many years has it made profit, that could be considered an anomaly, and that is where sometimes these opinions or these factors which are looked at for analysis are not based on actual facts. So there are some limitations and some weaknesses and some benefits of using this as a tool when you start to look at analysis, or analyzing a particular situation, maybe a particular context or a problem, but yet it is a basic tool from which you start making some sort of, you start to look at, you make a start from somewhere, and that is where SWOT comes in. Now, as an example, what we will look at is, let's look at Apple, is a company which everybody is very familiar with. And what we want to be able to look at is, how do we look at doing a SWOT analysis of Apple? So when we look at a large organization which is touching a turnover or market capitalization of almost 1 trillion, a very successful company, and when we look at doing some SWOT, so what we are trying to do with this analysis is, as an example in this, trying to capture some of the factors which are considered strengths and weaknesses of Apple itself as a company. So here, when we look at SWOT, what we want to be able to do is, we want to be able to look at doing the SWOT of Apple from a point of view of studying some particular features. So what we are looking at is, let's compare and do some analysis on the advertising capabilities, what is vertical integration, sales, things like, over dependence on the iPhone, incompatibility in terms with other OS. Now, these are some of the, weaknesses that we get to see when we look at Apple. So Apple products are quite generic, but they do not, they are not easily compatible with some of the other, devices which are available. You need a very specific interface or a device to be able to work with Apple gadgets or Apple projects. And the other thing is they've entered into, so what we've done is we've looked at a broad situation of things which are happening in and around Apple. Because of their business expanding, they're advertising more, they're trying to integrate or buy companies to try and bring in more services and products. Like they bought the headphone company a couple of years back. Obviously, so what we're going to do is pick up one of the factors to be able to look at SWOT analysis as far as Apple is concerned. So I've got a snapshot of Apple company in terms of key facts here. This data is 2016, 2015, 2016 financial year data. And then let's look at some of the strengths, of what are these strengths that we look at for Apple. So, obviously it has a very large advertising budget. It's spending nearly about $2 billion in terms of advertising, which is almost double from, 2011, because iPhone has become fairly successful. It advertises, most of its advertising campaigns are in and around iPhone. We've not seen anything else being advertised apart from the Apple Watch and the iPhone. If you see some of the adverts, it's primarily on print and others, but TV advertising is mostly on that. Now, its expenses have climbed because it's trying to advertise some of its flagship products, and which tend to be strength because that is where most of the revenue is coming from. And in comparison, when they compare it against the next biggest competitor for them, which is Samsung, and that's the Galaxy Tab. So Apple's spend is almost 0.77% in terms of its sales. So just about under 0.75% is the ratio of their spend on sales versus its advertising. And if I compare that with Samsung's, so they are almost they're almost half or more than half of what Samsung is advertising in terms of its budgets, in terms of in terms of advertising budget. Now, some of the weaknesses. So the strengths are obviously, we have listed out a few strengths, that it's present in a lot of countries. It has a lot of products. It's quite stable in terms of revenue. They make a lot of profit. Its main competitors are listed here. It's an old company which has been going for a number of years, and over the years it has brought out very revolutionary products. And what they've been doing is they've been focused on brand advertising, which is basically creating strong demand for their products. Now, this is a strength, and there is no doubt about that. Now, let's look at weaknesses. So if you look at weaknesses of Apple, what we're looking at is they have a lot of over dependence on iPhone. Most of the sales is coming from the iPhone products. Other products like the iMacs, iPads, watches, other accessories and things like that are growing, but not growing at the pace at which the iPhone is growing. So if iPhone tomorrow is to fall off the market or fall off the cliff and the demand for that tapers off, then they will have a major loss in their revenue. So this is one of the weaknesses. They need to diversify. This is the constant thing which Tim Cook and the senior management at Apple is looking at, is how do they look at growing revenues from other products as against just the iPhone. Now, some of the markets that they are weak in, which is not allowing them to capture sales from Samsung, markets like India, China, they've done a deal with China Telecom and some of the other providers, which has helped them to look at strengthening their sales. But main markets like India, which has overtaken the US, the second largest mobile phone market in the world, wherein Samsung is a market leader with over 40% market share, they have not been able to crack. So this is one of the greatest weaknesses which Apple has. Now, they have a very low expenditure on research and development as compared to other companies, because once the iPhone came out, they have not invested very heavily in terms of bringing out new products. When the iPad came out, I think a couple of years back, you could have, I don't know whether you remember, but some of the campaigns which basically talked about from competitors' point of view were that it's like an iPhone on steroids. So there has not really been any major product development which is happening. They are investing in R&D, but the investment is low as compared to some of his other competitors who are kind of putting a lot of money, in terms of the products to come out with new products. And other thing is weaknesses in terms of incompatibility with other devices. So you have to have an Apple device to be able to work and things like that. Now, some of the opportunities which they have, which I've listed is, things like they are creating new markets. For example, they were the first one to introduce Apple Pay. Samsung followed, and a couple of others companies have followed. They are looking at, providing connected services, which is called the Internet of Things. That means their products are able to talk to each other, which is where the opportunities lie. They've started to come out with the iWatch 2 years back, and it kind of has revolutionized the market because it's able to look at medical applications or healthcare related applications. And obviously, with the sale of their iPads, iPad Pro and other bits increasing, what is happening is that gaining traction into the business side of the market as compared to just being consumer side of the market. So when you buy an app or a particular game or, in a productivity software from the App Store, they gain revenue and subscription because you're going to be using that time and again. That allows them to, earn recurring revenue from its current subscriber base. Now, so the threats we're looking at on the broader side, we are looking at, there is a lot of competition which is catching up with Apple and its type of products. So you have, MIUI, Mi or Mizoni, which has come out from Samsung, Huawei. So the other products from the Japanese manufacturers, which is Sony. You have Samsung, LG. Some of the other competitors have similar products, and consumers have a choice. So if they get something cheaper, then obviously that allows the consumer to buy something apart from the iPhone, and that means that it could be an imminent threat as far as their market share, revenue, and profit. Dollar, because they are based in the US, so obviously a stronger dollar affects exports and imports. So their imports becomes dearer, cheaper, but the exports, because it makes the iPhone outside America, so sometimes exports into countries become dearer, and that is considered a threat because they try and maintain prices of the product across the globe, which is price is pretty much the same whether you buy here in the UK or in the US. But if the dollar becomes stronger, then obviously regional pricing starts, which could be a threat, and some of the competitors could offer prices lower than their products to be able to gain market share and obviously make more profits. Lawsuits, we see a lot of patent battles now happening between mobile phone companies like Qualcomm, Samsung, Google, Sony, because the line between the thin line between the technology companies is disappearing, because most of the phones are very similar features. And sometimes in the past, if you've read and seen on the news that Apple had sued Samsung and then lost the case, and they were ordered to pay $670 million in damages because it was claimed that Samsung has copied the home button and some of the applications which Apple has introduced. So and Apple has in turn been sued by Samsung. That case is under consideration. So a lot of these kind of potential threats could happen because of lawsuits which are happening, because the line between technology and most of the phones providing this similar functionality are increasing in the market. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Now let's look at the other tool, which is PESTEL Analysis. Now in PESTEL, basically it has a lot of different type of this tool is quite a broad tool. So sometimes you will hear the term PEST, which is only looking at political, economic, social, and technological factors. Sometimes you will have PESTEL. You will also have other variants which we will add an S before PESTEL, and that would tend to look at macro analysis. That means you're looking at a bigger external factors which are primarily environmental led or which are beyond the control of an organization. So here it is a tool which looks at some of the macro factors which affect the business or an organization, and these factors could be political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. And here the idea is to understand, once you've understood the strengths and weaknesses and you have done the internal external analysis, what you want to now look at is a macro or a bigger environment in terms of the sector or the industry, and how does that affect not just affect you, but others in the same sector or the industry as well. So if mobile phone sales start to go down and people stop buying smartphones, it will not just affect Apple, but it will affect all the others in the market, Samsung, Mizoni, you look at Sony, Huawei, and all those, because the sales would tend to go down. So when you have a recession in the market and people try and not spend money and, basically save money, then that means that, the sales are going down for all the companies, not just for one company. And in those cases, you end up using something to analyze the market, and that tool then that you use is something called the PESTEL analysis. So here the aim of doing PESTEL analysis to look at finding out the current external factors affecting the organization. What could be these external factors which could change in the future? So like an exchange rate almost changes on a daily basis. But if we are to leave the European Union, you will see that as of now, we are in a transition period, because for the next 2 years, we'll continue to trade with Europe. But after that, it would change, because we would have left the European Union on 31st of March 2019. And that would mean that because we will not have the access to the single market, at some stage, those external factors will become permanent. So you keep looking at analyzing these external factors which could change or bring about a change in the future as well, not just a pointed time in today, or in a pointed time in next month, but also in the near future. Now here the idea is also to look at understanding and broadening opportunities. So when we say opportunities and threats, here we need to be looking at dwelling deeper into what could be the opportunities and how do we look at treating those opportunities so that they could become strengths, and how do we look at treating those threats which could then become not become weaknesses, but which could be countered before it kind of dents the business operation or brings in, starts to affect the business in a larger way. And sometimes what we look at is, when we do this analysis, it helps us get an overall picture of where the firm or the business actually stands within the industry or the sector, within the particular economy, or a country, and within the global context. So this is a tool which is quite a broad tool, and it helps you develop an understanding on the business, from to create an overall picture of not just the company, but also the environment in which the business operates. So this is the reason why we look at using this tool. And the process of using this tool, when we look at people or managers actually using it in the real terms, would be to look at gathering a lot of information, which could be, sometimes you will see companies look at political reports, they look at budgets, they look at, the forecast by the Office of National Statistics and things like that. And they consider these reports, to look at making decisions, is because they cannot, some of these factors are beyond the control of the organization or the business. And that is where they have to look at building these long-term changes which could affect the business, or announcements in the budget, for example, which affect the business, and they have to be calculated, because it's not that you're starting a business today. You have already, say for example, this year in the budget, the Chancellor increased, the duty on alcohol, cigarettes and things like that. But there's a lot of inventory already available in the market. So what will the business have to do? They have to factor in these changes or the announcements which come in. And in some cases, they have to kind of, proactively anticipate that these changes will be introduced, and then start to look at, maybe liquidation, or, start to look at churning up the inventory, or slowing down the supply, so that it does not affect their inventory and stock situation in the market. So what will happen is, they will not say that, okay, you can start selling it at a slightly higher price, but that would mean that the retailer would actually end up making lower margins, because the government has increased the duty or the price. So the retailer would then come back and say, okay, we need a compensation, for this rise in duty, because it also applies on the existing stock, not just on the stock that we haven't bought from you. So the process actually starts by gathering data from all possible sources. And then once you've gathered this data, what we do is we kind of, segment this into different, factors. So, and then the segmentation being done is basically, that means you identify all the things which will affect the business or the sale of the product. And in this case, because of the rise of duty, and what you do is you classify them into political, economic, socio-cultural, and technological. So when we look at doing this PESTEL, this is a template which covers pretty much all the factors that would come into the consideration when you utilize this tool. So when we look at political factors, you would look at things like, government stability, likely changes. Now there's a lot of discussion happening that within the Tories that Theresa May might have to go as a prime minister. She's losing a majority in the Tory party, and that is a political factor. But now that's not going to happen shortly. It could happen in the near term if the Brexit talks happening now in December, trade talks, do not succeed. Then there are maybe 40 MPs if they rebel. What will happen is it'll trigger some sort of a leadership challenge, and there would be somebody who would need to, Theresa May will have to go, and obviously there might be a legal challenge because of which we'll have a change in prime minister. So this is a change which is political change, but will need to be analyzed with its own set of parameters and factors which affect why this change could come about. So in PESTEL, you start to look at dwelling into each of these changes which are categorized according to the categories, and then you look at each of these changes in a much more greater detail. Now, in some cases, so this was PEST, only looking at the 4 factors, but then we add environmental and ecological, in some cases it's called, and the legal factors. So these could be, for example, if I think I read in the newspaper today that Britain is braced for 4 inches of snow. That would mean if that much of snow is to fall, that means in those cases, we might definitely have 1 or 2 days off, and the businesses would struggle to, resume operations. So that would be weather affecting the business. And in that case, the Chancellor used the term productivity. If you have to take unplanned leave, or you're not able to reach the office, or you're spending far too much time on the roads on that day, that means your overall hours that you spend in the office in doing the work would have reduced the productivity for that particular day. So that is an environmental change, or a factor which is affecting the business operations on that particular day, and that will be classified as weather or climate change. And similarly, when we look at legal changes, you're looking at some of these things which can come into play. For example, copyright infringement. Now, this is not something which will happen overnight, but the company would be monitoring. Apple would be monitoring Samsung and a couple of others in terms of new features being released on the phone. And when they concur that, okay, this has definitely been an infringement, then they would file a lawsuit. So these are changes which do affect the business, but their effect on the business is, let's put it this way, could be seasonal, could be short term, could be long term, but these are factors which are also considered when we look at doing market analysis using PESTEL. Is that okay? Now, there are lots of different things that we look at, and as an example, what I've looked at is I've done a small example of a PESTEL analysis from a point of view of UK. So what we've looked at is the 4 different factors like political, economic, social, cultural, and technological. And here what I've done is I've said in the long run, the Chancellor is putting, is giving more favor and incentive to the experimentation of driverless cars in London. So he set aside some sort of a budget. If you have a car which is not a diesel or a petrol car, but is an eco-friendly car, either a hybrid or a battery operated one, obviously you will get more, for example, you'll not get taxed when you drive into the city of London, and there'll not be any particular, say for example, your road tax is less. The other side of requirements, in terms of providing incentives is there. So if you look at doing a PESTEL, which is long, a macro analysis of where and how the budget would be and how it's affecting the economy, what I've done is I've tried to do that example here by putting it into a PEST analysis. Is that okay? So that is where what I would do is basically stop. Now, there are one last thing which I want to look at in the presentation is, look at giving you an example of when we studied the various research techniques. We looked at, things like, to the best of my knowledge, I think I still have to send you the handout for last time, because what I did talk about was a research onion, and I'll send that to you today. Now, in the research onion, what we look at is basically, you look at a research paradigm, you look at a research strategy, then you develop that into an approach, and then you pick up a research technique. And after that, what you do is you basically start doing the sampling. That means you go out and collect data, whether through questionnaires, primary research, whether it's secondary research, published sources, or tertiary, which is published and primary research in some cases. What you do is when you have gathered all that data, what you do is how do you present, how do you interpret those findings is the key bit when we look at, presenting it in some sort of table, graph. I mean, no, oh, right. Okay, just check. Yeah, I'm on the session, yeah. Oh, it's just 2 minutes, is that okay? I'm just to tell you some good news about it. Right, okay, thanks, Charles. Okay. So what you tend to do is basically when you put these findings is you kind of, you've collected a lot of data, you've gathered it, you've analyzed it, but in order to present that data, what we tend to do is we use, various techniques to be able to kind of present it so that people can actually derive meaningful conclusions out of it. And some of the ways that we are able to do this in terms of presentation of these findings, interpretation of these findings, is through the use of graphs, tables, and charts. We also, towards the end, put our recommendations in. And to a certain extent, when you present these findings, what you also do is you look at presenting it from a point of view of what is the limitation that you face while doing the research, and what could be the future areas of research if somebody has to carry that forward. And that is what we look at in particular, when we look at presenting these research findings, from a point of view of, from a point of view of sharing the findings that you have been able to gather, the information that you have gathered, which has been processed into, data, and that data primarily looking at, presentation in terms of data being presented meaningfully by the use of, charts, graphs, tables, and, say for example, you could have different types of charts like pie charts and this and that becomes, much more presentable. Now, in order to give you an idea in terms of how you would do a research and finally you would present it, would be to look at this last bit, which I'm explaining, is just to give you an example. So here, one of the learners has actually done a research in terms of, finding out what is the impact of consumer behavior on internet marketing and, how companies use that. So a lot of companies study your habits in terms of, how you browse the internet, what kind of features you look at, how some of these things you do a bit of research on help you then finally make purchases. So if you've used Amazon, for example, and you've gone in and browsed a few items on Amazon on the Black Friday, for example, Black Friday sale, what it does is it keeps track of your searches that you've done on Amazon, what products you've browsed, and then the next day you get a newsletter which comes to you saying that, okay, this product is available at this much sale, this is the offer on that product. And the reason why they're able to do that is because they're able to study and keep a track of what have you browsed, which store you've been to, what kind of products you're looking at. And basis that, they try and predict your behavior in terms of how you would buy and purchase a particular product if you're given an offer or a discount and things like that. So once assuming you've done that research and you've collected that data, what you do is you present that data in a meaningful manner so that somebody looking at those parameters would then be able to logically interpret how this is being done. So first of all, we start across with looking at presenting this by saying, okay, let's look at the age group, demographics of who came in and browsed, how long you've had the account for, whether you're male, female, what is your age, and you start off with that demographic analysis. After you've done that, because you would have created an Amazon profile, and that profile helps them get some idea in terms of whereabouts are you living, your income level and things like that, and that is where they would get some data about the type of buyer you are, whether you are in terms of classification A, B, C, A, D kind of buyer. That means, are you in the lower income group, middle income group, higher income group? And once that is there, what they then tend to look at is, have you done any previous purchases on the store? What kind of reviews you've left? And if you bought particular products, what are the kind of products you bought? Have you bought just technological products? Have you bought pricey products? So they have lots of data that they can look at when you made some purchases on Amazon. And that is then presented using graphs, tables, and some sort of meaningful interpretation, so that if somebody is to understand how people buy products on Amazon, they would look at this particular study, and when you presented it nicely in terms of breaking each of the points down, making that data interpretable, and that data simply providing some statistics about what type of users come to Amazon, when they buy, how they buy, what is the average buying price, what kind of things they consider for looking at making decisions, whether you visited the review section, have you asked a question, things like that. So those are bits and pieces which then can be presented in some sort of a form for them to be able to look at. And this is done when you present your findings using chart, tables, graphs. You look at interpretation in terms of explaining why this has been the case. You must have done a sample size, and all those bits and pieces that we look at is nothing but interpreting of research data. Is that okay? So this is an example of how things could be put together after you've done some research, whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary. But what you try and do is bring those findings and your understanding of what you've researched, and then put it onto a piece of paper, and there you're putting these findings across, which can be easily understood, easily interpreted, and can be used to do further research on the topic, or to develop them further, for them to look at meaningful interpretations. Is that okay? So that was the the learning outcome 3 that we want to look at: understanding the tools and techniques using which you are able to interpret market, and say, for example, market situations, interpret situations or factors which affect the company, a business, or an organization. And some of these tools at level 3 that we want to understand and develop a deeper understanding into will be various forms of PEST or PESTEL analysis, and to a certain extent the entry level tool which is called SWOT analysis. Now what I'm going to do is obviously send you 2 handouts which I've taken across from a website called Strategic Management Insight, and this basically will explain the tool in a greater detail. And some of the data that I presented today has been borrowed from these handouts, so it'll give you a good understanding of what we've discussed using the PowerPoint presentation, and it'll discuss and give you some meaningful insights into various forms of PEST or PESTEL analysis that you can do. And similarly for SWOT, so a small handout on SWOT which basically explains what kind of framework is it, where is it used, the benefits and limitations. And in some cases towards the end, what I've tried to do is take up a particular analysis for a company, which will help you understand how this tool is actually put into practice. Is that okay? Now, this site is a good site because it gives you some practical examples of various companies, and SWOT analysis of various companies. So for example, I've taken PEST from here, but you can go into, say, for example, SWOT analysis, and when you click on that, you can pick up a SWOT analysis of a particular company. I've looked at Amazon. You could do for I've looked at Apple. You could do for Amazon, and it'll give you why and how it has been done, what factors they've analyzed, and things like that. So it's a good site from which you can primarily look at some additional information to understand and maybe do it yourself in terms of analysis. So if you pick up a company which is your favorite, and what you would do is basically, after reading the handout that I've given you, you might decide to do that. Okay, on a piece of paper you want to do the SWOT analysis, and once you have done that, what it will be good to do for you would be to look at comparing it with what the site has actually presented, just as an exercise for you to get used to with the tool. Is that okay? Any questions so far, Qasim? Right. So what I'm going to do is, apart from this, I know that you've sent me an email, so you finish your unit 1. I'm going to try and come back to you with some sort of a feedback on that before Friday. We have a visit from ATHE, tomorrow, so it won't be possible tomorrow, but Thursday or Friday, I'll give you a full feedback on that, and I'm going to try and see and give you, obviously that's a kind of a summative assessment that we're going to do, and then also try and give you a grade on that assessment. And this is something that we'll print out and obviously keep aside for the visit. So when you are completing the course, one of the units you've done, there are 3 others to go. So, what we'll try and do is basically, as in when you complete the units, hopefully towards the end, when we, award a grade, that will also be awarded by the, awarding organization. And we'll ensure that if there are bits and pieces which I think will help you achieve a distinction, I will give you specific feedback. So if you want to improve it further, that will help you achieve your grade and move towards the distinction. But let me have a quick, read through on that in detail, and then give you some summative feedback by Thursday, Friday.
Right.
Okay. Good stuff. Now, apart from that, if you have any further questions, I'm going to send you an email on this and also on the previous session, and I'll put these up on Moodle so that you have it for your reading, and you could then look at doing corresponding tasks which we have covered in up to learning outcome 3 for this unit. I think in the next session, what we'll do is, it's an interesting topic, which is e-marketing or internet marketing in business. Is something which we'll look at, and that will help us wrap up this particular unit, hopefully in the next session.
Right.
Okay. Good stuff. So